Hey, David Brister here within the Chordplay, and this is the Chords of Steve Clark. And definitely Def Leppard is a legendary, well-respected band, very popular band too. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees, and their legacy goes all the way back to the late '70s. And Steve Clark, passed away in '91, and it is a very sad, kind of story attached with him. So I don't really want this to be a sad, episode of Chordplay. We're going to look at, some of his music and kind of break down some of the Riffmaster's, secrets. And definitely, even today, Steve Clark is still respected. People still bring him up and talk about him and his music. And he really did have a really interesting way of putting chords and progressions and, guitar parts together. So this lesson is going to be a tribute to him and kind of tap into some of his ideas and moves and kind of secrets. In a lot of ways, the biggest thing you can learn from someone like Steve Clark is just the construction and assembly of a good rock song. And historically, in rock music, I mean, you can go back to the Beatles, obviously Led Zeppelin, Van Halen, and, Black Sabbath, and there's a bunch of bands out there where the guitarists were excellent, kind of craftsmen of music. George Harrison definitely seemed to have the right chord at the right time, in all those classic, Beatles songs. Hendrix, of course, had a really interesting way of putting his chords and ideas together. Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin, Eddie Van Halen, and the list goes on, and Steve Clark definitely fits in that group of musicians. And although he may not be as respected, as say someone like Jimi Hendrix, he's still a very important guitarist to kind of notice and learn from, because it is kind of a lost art, especially these days. You see people just kind of banging out chords. Well, Steve Clark really wasn't a shredder. He wasn't like Steve Vai or somebody. He was more of a kind of just a creative entity, and he, had definitely a lot of music knowledge and theory under his belt, so he knew what he was doing. And Pete Willis and also Phil Collin, other guitarists in Def Leppard, they were admittedly both, feel players and ear players. They didn't really know scales and theory and keys and progressions and things. But Steve Clark did. And if you work on his music, you can actually see it. And it's like, whoa, he, definitely put his chords together, very intelligently. And just in case you weren't alive in the 1980s, I just want to kind of share this. There was a time when Def Leppard was huge and they were enormously successful. And they were one of those 80s groups you couldn't get away from their music. There was Michael Jackson, there was Def Leppard, there's Madonna, Bon Jovi, and Van Halen, and some of these groups. And it's like they just dominated the radio, MTV, magazines, and the music industry. So Def Leppard definitely, they were huge. And they're still, really, really successful, really famous, and very popular. But back in the 80s, they were enormous. In a lot of ways, they kind of paved the way and opened the door for all the 80s rock and hair metal that came after them. Because it really wasn't until the song Photograph, from Pyromania came out. And that, blew up on radio and it blew up on MTV. And it really did push that door open. And then the next thing you knew, they were, 80s rock bands and hair metal bands everywhere. And in a lot of ways, Def Leppard kind of helped kick that door in. The first song's from the album High and Dry. This is Switch 625, and this is an instrumental kind of, Steve Clark showcase in a way. And really, Def Leppard didn't have a lot of instrumental songs. This is kind of a rare, situation earlier in their career. And definitely High and Dry is a killer album. That's basically back when Def Leppard was really rocking, High and Dry and Pyromania, and things changed on Hysteria. And Hysteria is a great album, but they definitely became softer and they didn't have that hard edge, that they started with. You'll just hear this kind of sustained, arpeggiated three-chord progression, and they're all, all three chords are kind of related to G. So it starts off with this G, G5 or a G power chord, and then it moves back to a G7 sus4, and then a G minor sharp 5. So there's a raised fifth again, augmented. And there's a couple, examples and chords in this lesson that are going to be flirting with that augmented sound. And, I just uncovered that in the George Lynch lesson recently. And in some ways, chord play is kind of coming full circle because you can go all the way back to the Tool lesson, and we started talking, you know, about raised fifths and augmented sounds, you know, like in Sober, Neon Blue Apocalypse, you know, some of those songs I broke down in the Tool lesson. Here we are in Def Leppard land, and we're hearing augmented chords again, which is pretty cool. So this 3-chord progression sounds like this. And you'll just hear him kind of play through it. And then you'll hear it kind of build up. And you can hear both guitars are both, you know, attacking that riff when the drums and the band comes in. And you can definitely hear the notes are kind of separated during that part a little bit more. Something like that. It's a really cool tune too. And I like that chord progression. It's unusual. And you've definitely, you know, probably seen enough episodes of Chordplay to know that I love unusual chords, especially that last one. You know, really cool, G minor sharp 5. The next example is from Rock Rock Till You Drop, and that's the opening track, you know, from Pyromania. So if you've ever heard Pyromania, you know, pop it on and just hit play on the first track, and you'll hear this. And it's a D major 13, and he's picking through it, you know, as an arpeggio. And the fingering's a little different too. I like it. You can see we've got the 5th fret on the A, the 4th fret on the D, and the 6th fret on the G. And then we're also using the open B in there too. And then he reaches over and grabs the 7th fret there on the low E string. That's a B. And that's going to change that to a B sus2. So avoid the A string now when you include that B note. And truth be told, I usually just leave my middle finger held down, and even if that note's sustained, it's still part of the chord. So it's okay, you know, if you hear that B note, you know, kind of sneaking in there over the B sus2. And then just to be thorough with that chord, if we do leave that D held down, even though we're not really picking that A string, that would become, instead of a B sus2, that'd be a B minor add 9. Which that in itself is a really cool chord, you know, just strumming through it. Really cool sound. Next example is Too Late for Love, which is also on Pyromania. And this is an interesting chord series because he's dealing with partial chords, and it's just little fragments of these chords. So there's an E power chord that kind of moves to an E augmented. So we're right off the bat already flirting with that augmented or the raised 5th, right? So right there, he's kind of playing the low E open. He starts, you know, with an E power chord, and then he hammers on to the raised 5th, which is that, you know, B sharp. Technically, you know, it's going to look like a C, but we're raising that. And you can see there, it becomes part of a C, and then he slides it up to a partial D. So there's these little pieces of chords. Next example is from the song Hysteria, which is from the album Hysteria. Definitely a huge, you know, hit single for Def Leppard. And there's a D add 11 in the beginning. And, you know, simply because I'm familiar with the band, and I'm obviously, you know, familiar with a lot of rock music, I'm guessing they stole this from Pink Floyd as far as the chord, because you can hear this in Goodbye Blue Sky, you know, from Pink Floyd to the Wall. So it has a very, you know, distinct sound. And, you know, the first time I heard this song, I heard it and I was like, God, why does that remind me of Pink Floyd? And then, of course, you know, later I kind of heard the two back to back, and it was like, oh, that's why it's making me think of Pink Floyd. But you're just playing this partial chord. really love that chord sequence. It has a nice, kind of balanced sound. And I like the way it blurs from that D add 11 and then it moves to the G major 7. Because you're hearing almost the exact same chord except the root note changed. And that's very clever. And then guess where it goes right here? That E minor add 9. How many times have we seen that in Chordplay? It all kind of started way back with Pink Floyd, the very first episode. And there it is again. We were just talking about that in the docking lesson, and here it is popping up in Def Leppard's music. So that's a very, very familiar sound. All right, the next example is from Bringing On The Heartache, which is also from High and Dry, and this is a little bit more of an elaborate chord sequence. So he's kind of playing with like an A power chord, and he opens up the G string to play the open G, and then that kind of changes it to an A7. And then you'll hear it kind of move to like a partial A minor, partial G. And then there's this D9 over F, which is actually a pretty common chord in rock. You can find that actually in the song Panama from Van Halen and a bunch of other songs. And then it's kind of moving into like a little bit of B flat major, and then a little bit of E7 over B. It's really just the top 3 strings there. Now that guitar part definitely is orchestrated and kind of assembled in a very clever way, and this is, one of the main reasons why they nicknamed Steve Clark the Riffmaster, because he had such a good, kind of instinct and talent for finding these kind of connecting, chords in a progression kind of maneuvers, and that's a trait that's really hard to pick up. A lot of people, when they grab a guitar, they'll just bang out some chords or play a couple licks or whatever. But Steve, kind of approached it almost like a scientist, and that's really cool, the way he kind of put all that together. Really, really cool stuff. All right, the last example comes from the song Foolin, which is on Pyromania, and honestly, I think this is my favorite Def Leppard song. I've always liked it. I love the intro, and then it rocks, and then it kind of gets moody and soft, and then it rocks again. And just a really cool song. And I really like this, kind of chord progression and what he's doing with the chords here. So they're all loosely based around A, and it does kind of play with the A sus2 in the beginning. And then you're going to hear that move up to an A augmented sus2. So once again, we're playing with that raised fifth. And then the final chord, that's an A minor 9 flat 13, which is really interesting. So right there, you can almost kind of hear the song just by kind of playing through those chords. And I really like the way he kind of mixes up that arpeggio. It's not the exact same way every time, so your ear hears something different, each time it comes around, which is really, really interesting. Really cool stuff. All right, let's gonna wrap up this look at the chords of Steve Clark and some of the music of Def Leppard. And definitely he's a very interesting and good guitarist to kind of study and notice some of the things he did, because while he wasn't really like a shred crazy technical guitarist, he really was like a very good kind of musical architect. All right, leave some comments and some feedback, and please subscribe to Late Night Lessons, and I'll be back with some more material and content and lessons before you know it. Thank you.